You want to compare evolutionary history using cladograms? Ha! You're in the right place. It's me, Moser. And after this video, you should be able to use a cladogram to find the common ancestor of two groups or species. You should also be able to use a cladogram to find a shared derived characteristic and to determine their source. You should be able to use a cladogram to compare the relative relatedness of two groups. And it'd be really helpful if you already knew what a cladogram was and knew what a shared derived characteristic and a common ancestor are. That would be good. So, now that you know what a cladogram is, and you're familiar with some of the basic terms that are connected to structural evidence of evolution, let's work on using a cladogram to compare the evolutionary history of a few groups of vertebrates. So here's a cladogram of vertebrate groups. Now, notice that we are not talking about individual species here, just larger groups. We'll move on to cladograms at the species level in a little bit. So first, let's look at the common ancestor of the groups shown. Could you identify which point shows the common ancestor of birds and crocodiles? That's where you want to pause the video and try to mark it. Well, where is it? Oh, it's right here. We're tracing back the line from the groups that we're thinking about to the point where they meet. Well, what about the common ancestor of birds and turtles? Again, this is where you would want to pause the video. Go ahead and mark it. Is that what you marked? If it is, great. Again, all we're doing is taking that line from birds and tracing it back to the point where it splits from the line that goes to turtles. Not so bad. Okay, let's try the common ancestor of lungfish. Lungfish? Really? Yeah, lungfish. And mammals. Pause the video. Mark it. Drum roll. Did you say right there? I certainly hope so, because we're just doing the same thing, tracing back the line from mammals until the point where where the lungfish line split off. That's the common ancestor. So now, here's a challenge. Where on this cladogram is the common ancestor of every single group shown? Ooh, good question. Pause the video. Mark it. Did you say right there? I hope so. Because if we go from birds straight back, that is the lowest branch point. Lamprey, that's the common ancestor between birds and lamprey. We can follow the line from sharks and rays back to that point, or from ray-finned fish back to that point. All of them. This point gives us the common ancestor of all of the species, or all the groups, that are shown here. Now, do we know what that common ancestor is? Heck no. But that's okay. We don't have to. To work with a cladogram, we don't even have to know what all these groups are. You know what mammals are, and you know what turtles and birds are. You know what amphibians are, but what the heck's a lungfish? A ray-finned fish? Is that like a bluegill? Yes, actually it is. But what's a lamprey? It's okay. You don't have to know what the groups are that you're working with. You just have to be able to find the common ancestors and find the relationships between them. So, now let's work at identifying all the shared derived characteristics, I'll abbreviate that as SDC, that we can see on the cladogram. For each shared derived characteristic shown, all the species after or above or to the right of that shared derived characteristic have it. So let's look at paired limbs for terrestrial locomotion. That would be this. And this little dot on the cladogram represents the development of that shared derived characteristic. So what we're saying is that every group above that point on the cladogram has that characteristic. So that would be amphibians, mammals, lizards and snakes, turtles, crocodiles and alligators, and birds. They all have paired limbs for terrestrial locomotion. Okay, so where did they all get these paired limbs for terrestrial locomotion? Well, from some common ancestor that happened somewhere here. But it's a common ancestor that didn't contribute to lungfish, because lungfish don't have paired limbs for terrestrial locomotion. Quiz time! Do mammals have lungs or a swim bladder that is derived from gut material? This characteristic. Well, do they appear to the right of that point on the cladogram or above it? They do. So, yeah, they have lungs or a swim bladder derived from gut material. Where did they get their lungs or a swim bladder derived from gut? From whatever common ancestor they shared with lungfish and amphibians and everything above them on the list. Some common ancestor had that characteristic. The ray-finned fishes got it, and the lungfish and the amphibians, sharks and rays, don't have it. Lampreys don't have it because they don't share that common ancestor. Now, do you have to know what a characteristic is to understand which groups have it or where they got it? No. It doesn't matter if you know what the characteristic is. You can still identify the groups that have it. You know there are many styles of cladograms, so what if our cladogram is arranged a little differently? We're going to look at two alternative arrangements of the same information. This one is the dreaded upside-down cladogram. It's not really upside down, but it is the less common way to show the information, so it looks upside down to most people. Now, notice that in this cladogram, the groups of living things, right here, are below the line, and the shared derived characteristics are all up above the line. It doesn't matter. It's as if they just flipped the bar over. Same information, and you still read it left to right. So, let's find the common ancestor of lungfish and amphibians. Same process. Here's my lungfish. Here's my amphibians. Oh, there's their common ancestor. It's the point where the furthest back line comes off of the main line. Easy. Trace their lines back to where they share a common point. What about determining which groups share a derived characteristic? Look at the shared derived characteristics and then look above or to the right of it. All the groups listed above that shared derived characteristic have it. So, which groups have an egg with a membrane? Why, that would be the mammals, lizards and snakes, turtles, crocodiles and alligators, and birds. You did pause the video, right? Mark that down. What about cladograms that are shown like boxes, like this very, very badly drawn one? Well, this has got most of the same information as the two that we just looked at. Now, it doesn't show shared derived characteristics, but this style of cladogram can actually do a better job showing which groups have a more recent common ancestor, because the length of the lines and how close they are to the present, or the top or the right side, actually is meant to represent the amount of time that's passed. Now, please note, this is only an example. I'm terrible at drawing cladograms freehand, and I'm absolutely certain that all the common ancestors here are wrong. This kind of cladogram is usually generated by a computer using DNA sequences rather than just sort of pulled out of the brain of your biology teacher. We'll talk more about DNA sequence cladograms in the next grid. So we should look at, and you'll notice that this one was actually done by a computer. We should look at a cladogram that goes down to the species level. This is a square, quote-unquote, cladogram showing the relationship between a bunch of species of jellyfish. Every point where the lines split represents a speciation event, when one species splits into two. Some of them are pretty recent, some are way back in the distant past. The closer to the present that the speciation event occurs, and again, you read it from left to right, just like a book, the more recent the common ancestor of those two species. This would be more distant than this one. So let's Practice. Find and mark the common ancestor of Chrysora chinensis and Chrysora pacifica. Pardon my butchering of the Latin names. You paused? Did you find it? Okay. Did you mark that? That's their common ancestor. Now, find the common ancestor of Chrysora chinensis and Chrysora isocella. Where is that? Pause. Did you mark that point? I'm hoping you did. So, which common ancestor is more recent? Ding, ding, ding. This one. So, Chrysora pacifica and Chrysora chinensis have a more common recent ancestor. Which species shown on the cladogram above has the most distant, the furthest in the past, common ancestor to Chrysora lactea? Lactea? Sure. Did you find it? Did you mark it? Did you say this one? Yeah, that one's really challenging. To find the point where those lines converge, you have to follow this one way, way, way back. This is, whoops, scratch that. I got all excited and was looking for the common ancestor of Chrysora lactea and Nassithorhea. Whew, that's the most distant relationship here. Now, back to the question I actually asked. The common ancestor of Chrysora chinensis and Chrysora hydrocella. Well, we trace the lines back. This one goes back to there. This one goes back to there, and that's where they meet. So that's their most recent common ancestor. Not so far in the past. The more recent the common ancestor, the more closely related we say two species are. So, when we think about it that way, these two are the most closely related species on this cladogram. And this is the species that's the most distantly related to everything else. Its most recent common ancestor is further back than any others with every species on this cladogram. Okay, are you able to use a cladogram to find the common ancestor of two groups? Can you use it to find shared derived characteristics and determine their source? Can you compare how related two groups or species are? Excellent. So, go practice.